What is life? What does it mean? Yes, these can be questions typical of adolescence, but for John, the question, what is life, touches everything. You, me, the world, the divine nature, everything. I'm Kevin Caldwell. Welcome to Sacred Wisdom, Sacred Texts, an exploration of some of humanity's most influential sacred writings. They've become my soul friends, daily companions, spiritual guides, and springs of wisdom. The divine nature is towardsness. The divine nature is into-ness. The divine nature is embraceness, and the divine nature is openness. That's how I summarized John's vision of God during the previous episode. It's the unique masala that John offers to the curry of humanity's spiritual heritages. And I drew that summary from 3 of the verses in John chapter 1, verses 1, 2, and 18, skipping over 3 to 17, which we'll come back to in this episode. But those verses, 1, 2, and 18, again, read like this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was towards God, and God was the Word, this Word that was towards God in the beginning. No one's ever seen God, the one and only God, who leans into the Father's bosom. That one has brought out into the open and made known. Now it's time to dig into the rest of chapter 1 and the verses between 2 and 18 that I skipped, which I did because verses 1, 2, and 18 are connected by the theme of how John sees the inner life of the divine, if you will. It turns out that using a theme to link verses together from different parts of the section is not an isolated accident. It's a pattern within the way that John has created these verses, and we'll see more of that as we proceed. Because it turns out that John is an artist, and I want to touch a little bit more on the art of John as we get ready to dig more deeply into some of the other verses. Because in the first 18 verses, John is actually using 3 different literary forms, and he's woven them very carefully together, the whole section, into an intricate fabric. One of those literary genres, which connects that whole section, verses 1 through 18, connected by this particular literary genre, is a genre known as chiasm or ring structure. It's the main structure of this section, but it's just one of John's artistic forms. So my plan is to come back to it and say more in just a bit when I try to explain the artistic structure of this entire portion. The other literary forms John uses are both types of poetry, and I want to take them one at a time. Listen carefully again to verses 1 and 2. In the beginning was the Word was towards God, God was the Word, and this Word was towards God in the beginning. Notice how the last word in each clause becomes the opening of the next clause, creating a feeling of sort of rolling forward, like waves building and receding and building. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was towards God, and God was the Word that was towards God in the beginning. I call it rolling word links. It's kind of my word for it. And the same form is found again in verses 4 and 5, and I'll read it now. What has come to be in him, in that word, what has come to be in him was life, and this life was the light of all humankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not snuff out the light. This rolling linkage of words and clauses is the first poetic form in John. The second is a form called parallelism, a type of poetic expression especially common in ancient literature, including the poetic texts and the sacred scriptures of John's Hebrew literary heritage. There's an example in verse 3. Through him all things came to be, and without him nothing came to be. The two clauses are essentially saying the same thing, but the second serves in this case to intensify the point. All things came to be through him. The word, and that him is the word that's referred to in the prior verses. And then, in case we missed it, not one single thing came to be apart from him. So rolling word links and parallelism both suggest that we have the work of a poet here. Now, some people might see art and poetry as something different than truth. In my view, art is true, but true maybe in a different way than a didactic essay. To get to the way that John's work is true, we need to approach this section as a work of art and as poetry. We'll be saying more about this in the future, but now let me come to the rings. I called this episode The Lord of the Rings, and I need to explain that, and that will take us to this ring structure that I mentioned before. Of the three literary forms that I've identified, the most pervasive in this whole section, verses 1 through 18, is this ring structure. It's used to organize the entire section. And to get this more clearly, let me say a little bit more about the structure itself, and then I'll try to demonstrate how it's being used in John. In a work organized around a ring structure, phrases and clauses are paired by a theme common to each pairing, and then all the rings are organized in a concentric or mirrored pattern. In other words, the first and the final paired phrases share a theme, just as we saw in verses 1 and 2 on the one hand, and then verse 18 on the other in the prior episode. The theme being the divine nature in that case. That pairing of themes and sections carries on then into the next ring in a ring structure, where the second clause or sentence is paired with the next to final sentence or clause around a theme that those two pairs share, and so on for as many paired rings as an author creates, and some of them get incredibly complex. The number of rings varies, but they eventually come to a center point, and that center point might take one of two expressions. The center point might itself be another pairing, in other words, the last pairing in the rings. Or the center might simply be a single unique phrase all by itself, all on its own, without a twin. In either case, the result is that the rings serve to highlight the importance of what's at the center, what we might call the central ring, the ring that binds them all, but not like Tolkien in the darkness. Ring structure is a literary form, but it's also a way of thinking and a way of communicating. Unlike linear ways of communication in which everything builds towards a sort of climactic ending, ring structures build concentrically towards whatever jewel is set at the center of the rings. And strange as that is to us, it was actually a very common literary device in the ancient world. The poet Homer employed rings within the overall structure of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and then he also wove smaller ring patterns into discrete passages within both of those works. I'm not suggesting that John read Homer. However, the fact is that ring structures are found as well, not just in Homer, but in many portions of the Hebrew sacred texts. The ring structure was as known and as common as, say, haiku in Japan or the sonnet in Elizabethan England. As a result, John would have been familiar with this, not just in terms of literature, but again, as a way of thinking. I'm not sure familiar with does it justice. It was just in him. Again, I'm not thinking that he studied Homer or thought about ring structures. It just was in him. This concentric, circular way of creating literature and of thinking and of communicating was just in the air of John's time. It's how people thought and wrote. A moment ago, I referred to ring structure as unlike linear thinking, and that's true as far as it goes. The rings are in pairs, and they do draw attention to the centerpiece, and in that sense, they're unlike thinking in a line, a linear way, moving from one point to the next. At the same time, each statement or theme does also build from what precedes it. In other words, it's circular or ring structure and linear all at once. And this creates some unique challenges for someone like me trying to interpret such a passage and explain it to others, such as yourselves. For we have to pay attention to the rings, and how they're paired together, regardless of the linear sequence. And yet, at the same time, we have to pay attention to how the linear sequence is unfolding. Interpretation becomes a bit circular. For example, when I went to verse 18 directly from verse 2 and allowed the opening and the ending of the section to interpret each other, it enabled us to gain insights into the divine nature. That was appropriate because the structure called for it. It's how John is thinking. However, verses 3 to 5 and verse 17, which form the second pairing, need to be seen not only in light of each other, but then also in the light of whatever preceded them as well. And in the case of verse 17, for example, what follows it in verse 18. In fact, although I spent a lot of time unpacking verse 18 in the last episode, it will actually only reveal all of its fullness to us in the light of verse 17. Indeed, in the light of 1 through 17. Most commentaries do take the linear approach and just go verse by verse. Here's what's in verse 1, verse 2, verse 3, etc., and just proceed through the passage. I'm taking a different approach by starting with the rings, but I'm aware that I'm going to need to circle back at points to look at the sequencing as well. I'm also aware, as I've been preparing ahead of time, for how this is going to present some challenges in communicating things, but I think your patience will be rewarded if you stick with me. Now, how many rings are there in John chapter 1, verses 1 to 18? I think there's 4 concentric paired rings drawing us towards a 5th phrase, a single statement in this case, not another ring. It forms the centerpiece at the heart of the paired rings, placed like a precious stone or jewel in this beautiful ring. I'm going to read verses 1 through 18 completely to highlight what I think are the rings of concentric circles. And while I'm reading, I'm going to share with you also the themes, as I've labeled them at least, the themes that I see in each pairing. And I know it's going to be hard to follow simply by listening to this. What I'm calling ring A has 2 parts, for example, and A2 comes near the end after all the others, and it's going to be easy to lose that thread. So I'm also going to include this for you in a written form in the episode description in YouTube. But here we are. Ring A1, the nature of the divine life. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was towards God, and God was the Word. This Word that was towards God in the beginning. Ring B1, the availability of the divine life in the world. Verse 3, the Word through whom all things came to be, and without whom nothing came to be. What has come to be in him, in that Word, was life, and this life was the light of all humankind. That light still shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not snuff out the light. And then ring C1, the witness of a man named John the Baptist to the divine light and light. Verse 6, 7, and 8. It came about there was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness in order to bear witness concerning that light, so that through him everyone might believe. He himself was not the light. He came as a witness to the light. And then ring D1, the revelation of life and response. Verses 9, 10, and 11. There was the true light, the light that enlightens every person. That light was coming into the world. The light was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to what belonged to him, but they did not receive him. And then section E, what I've called the centerpiece. We can share in the divine life. Verses 12 and 13. To as many as those who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. They're not children related by blood. They're not conceived by natural human desire. They're not conceived as a result of a husband's will. They're children begotten by God. And then the ring structure begins to circle back, ring pair by ring pair. So the next section, moving on from E, which is the centerpiece, is D2, corresponding to what I labeled D1. So ring D2, the revelation of life and response. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. We saw his glory, the glory of one who is unique, one of a kind from the Father, whose nature was full of grace, fully worthy of trust. And then ring C2, working our way back out. The witness of John the Baptist to the divine life and light. John bore witness about the Word made flesh. He cried out, saying, "This is the one I meant when I said, 'Someone is coming after me, who has come to be prior to me, because he was before me.'" Continuing to move out, ring B2, the availability of the divine life in the world, verses 16 and 17. It's from his fullness that we've all received grace in return for grace, because the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came about through Jesus Christ. And then A2, the nature of the divine life. Verse 18, no one has ever seen God. The one and only God who leans into the Father's bosom, that one has brought out into the open and made known. Now, I'm going to be unpacking all of this in the future episodes, ring by ring, verse by verse, theme by theme, clause by clause. But first, I thought it might also be interesting and helpful to see how the rings flow if we reorganize them into a linear sequence, which most of us are probably more familiar with. In other words, moving from A1 to A2 instead of A1 to B1, and so on. This might be a little bit more familiar to the way we're accustomed to thinking and communicating. So I won't read all the verses again, but let me just outline the themes. Ring A, A1 and A2 combined, really touch on the nature of the divine life. That's the outermost pairing. Then the rings move in to ring B, the availability of the divine life in the world. And then to ring C, the witness of John the Baptist to the divine life and light. And then D, the revelation of life and the response to that life. And then E, we can share in the divine life. Now, I hope that isn't too confusing, especially without being able to visualize it as you listen. Again, I'm going to put all of this in the episode description for you in case that helps. Now, what's the point of all this? When I look at the outermost ring, A1 and 2, and then the centerpiece, E, I think John is wanting to emphasize two things at the same time. And both the circular and the linear ways of structuring things help reveal them. First, the nature of the divine being and the divine life, ring A. That's one thing John is trying to emphasize. And then the fact that we can share in that divine life, the centerpiece of the whole passage, ring E. It's interesting to me that depending on the type of discourse we're familiar with, we could easily miss at least the emphasis that's given on one of those two. So for those of us who are not accustomed to processing things in a ring, and we think in linear ways, we might be able to discern John's emphasis on the divine nature, because verses 1 and 2 begin with that, and verse 18 ends with that. And we would most likely be able to put all that together. Although we might miss the fact that verses 1 and 2 are shedding light on verse 18 and vice versa. And we might even be more likely to miss how important to John the centerpiece is, that we can share the divine life. However, for those accustomed to thinking just in rings like this, but not in a linear way, the main point of E is likely to be more clear than it would be to us who think in linear ways. In other words, it might be more clear that there's a fundamental concern that this is all about us and our ability to share in the divine life. But it might be possible to miss at least some of the things that John wants to show us about what the divine nature that we are invited to share in is like. In other words, one could get what God's nature is like and miss the invitation to share it. On the other hand, we could get that we can share in the divine life, but miss seeing what the fullness of the divine nature is like. The text in its current form, once we recognize the artistry of the rings, however, emphasizes both at the same time. Well, the outermost ring, as we've seen, verses 1, 2, and 18, serves as a window into the innermost nature of the life of God. The verses in the ring describe what God is really like in God's essence. And again, as I said at the opening, towardsness, intoness, embraceness, openness. But what about the innermost ring? What the centerpiece shows us is that the divine life described in that outer ring is a life that we can share. It's the precious stone in the center of the jewelry. John's purpose is not only to describe what God is like, John is writing so that we can share the divine life. It's for us. As John puts it near the end of the Gospel of John, these things are written so that you might have life. Well, how? How do we share in the divine life? The centerpiece in verses 12 and 13 conclude that the whole point of the section is that we too can share in the divine nature by becoming God's children. And as the text says, children begotten by God. To be begotten means something more than simply becoming divine children by adoption. It's not just a simile, not just that God loves human beings as if we are God's children. For John, we're in the realm of spiritual metaphysics, what really is. The begotten ones share the nature of the begetter. The begetter shares their DNA with the begotten. In this case, not physical DNA, but a sharing of divine life that could be described as human godlikeness. Now, we've seen that John has the book of Genesis in his mind. We saw that very clearly all throughout the very first episode. And one of the things that Genesis points out is that human beings have been made by God in God's own image and likeness. Humanity is, to some extent, godlike in its origins. When John says that we can be God's begotten children and share in the divine nature, divine life, I think it's John's way of describing a restoration of humanity in the image of God. And of course, if there's a restoration needed, then something has to have gone wrong. And we'll see what that might be as we continue. So, far from a God that simply stares at their own reflection in a mirror, all self-absorbed with towardsness and intoness and all those things we saw before, the God John wants us to experience is also in essence outward focused. Focused, dare we say it, on us. But not only us, of course. As John says elsewhere, God so loved the world, the whole cosmos. Now, for now, I'm emphasizing that John's purpose is to reveal the inner life of God and to reveal that we can share that life and be transformed by it and into it, meaning we can experience what it's like to be transformed into that same towardsness, intoness, embraceness, and openness of the divine nature, transformed into love. As a letter attributed to John put it, since God is love, then whoever loves God has been begotten of God, sharing the divine nature, which is love. Now, at this point, I want to come back to a point that I made in episode 2 related to the divine nature, in which I suggested that while the divine towardsness and intoness and embraceness in John could be taken to mean John sees God's inner life as sort of fully absorbed in God's own self-preoccupation, the reality is that these same qualities, along with the divine openness of verse 18, also swing outwardly towards us and towards the cosmos. God is, you might say, both an introvert and an extrovert. And in this episode, we're discovering that the divine nature, divine life, is meant to be our nature, our life, which means then that the towardsness and intoness and embraceness and openness that swing in both internal and external directions are ways of describing our human nature and our fullness and wholeness. I think John would say about us that being fully alive also means that we are towards and into, embracing and open relative to ourselves, and also at the same time towards, into, embracing and open towards others and the world around us. And God? John is saying that when we are who we are meant to be, the divine relationship is marked by a reciprocal towardsness, intoness, embraceness and openness. Elsewhere in my work, I've coined the term soulcialism, S-O-U-L, soulcialism, to describe this fourfold, outward, inward-facing, reciprocal relationship. Soulcialism is that interconnection of ourselves and with others, with nature and the cosmos, and with God. Most of my creative and meditative and academic work has been devoted to this vision of life and has been created by that vision of life and created that vision of life. As you can see, if you ever explore my music and poetry and other podcasts, Kevin Caldwell Music and Poetry, Kevin Caldwell Podcasts on YouTube. Well, I want to try to personalize this a little bit. You might not believe John's vision of God or in the divine at all, perhaps, but I don't think it's necessary to believe exactly the way John believes in order to engage with John's vision of life in a meaningful, experiential way. To get at this, I'm going to begin as John would. And to do so, I want to invite us to 3 imaginings. The first imagining I invite us to is imagining that however we might describe or understand the divine or ultimate reality, for John it is towards, into, embracing, and open, and all of those things are aimed at us. John believes we're loved. Whatever you or I may believe about the universe, I think John would want you and I to begin there. So the first imagining is to imagine the reality that I am beloved. The second imagining flows from that first one. Imagine what it may be like for you and I if we become more and more like the life that John is describing, if we become more towards, into, embracing, and open. So as such, I'm imagining myself becoming more and more towards myself and others and the world around me, more and more into myself and others and the world around me, more and more embracing of myself and others and the world around me, more and more open to and with myself and others and the world around me. As a small step towards that second imagining, you might want to just consider picking one person and imagine yourself being fully towards them, into them, more embracing of them, more open with them. The second imagining is to imagine and receive the reality that I am towards, into, embracing, and open to all. So the first imagining, I'm beloved, and the second, I am towards, I am loving. The third imagining, imagine an entire world like that. Could you begin to feel how different everything might be? Everything would be so different if, in fact, you and I and others, more of us, were, in fact, aware of how beloved we are and became more and more towards, into, embracing, and open to ourselves, others around us, the world around us, and to however we understand the divine. So I plan to take some time as I bring this to a close to give intentional space to these 3 imaginings, slightly reframed. I am loved, and I love. I'm towards, into, embracing, and open. The world is loved and is becoming full of love, becoming towards, into, embracing, open. Those are the 3 imaginings. Well, I'm going to bring it to a conclusion now, at least for this episode. This episode is focused on an overview of a picture that John is painting, a picture of the nature of the divine life and the possibility of being begotten as God's children, sharing in that divine nature, divine life. Moving forward, I'm going to be exploring the next ring, pairing of verses 3 and 5 on the one, 3, 4, and 5 on the one hand, and verses 16 and 17 on the other, which each describe how the divine life became and remains present in the world, available to us, available to the entire cosmos. And we'll take that up next time.